Before we talk about controversy, before we talk about VAR, before we talk about one of the most debated moments of this World Cup, I want you to forget everything you think you know about this match. Forget the headlines, forget the replay, forget the arguments that followed, forget who advanced. Because if we start there, we miss the real story. The real story isn't about technology, it isn't about slow motion replay, and it isn't even about Lionel Messi. The real story begins with a team that almost nobody believed could change football history: Egypt. When people remember great World Cup stories, they usually remember champions. Brazil in 1970, Spain in 2010, Argentina lifting the trophy. History has a habit of remembering the winners, but every once in a while, history leaves something behind. A performance, a moment, a feeling, a team whose story deserves to be remembered, even though it never reached the ending its supporters dreamed about. This is one of those stories. Before kickoff, almost every prediction sounded the same. Argentina would advance. Not because anyone disliked Egypt, not because Egypt hadn't earned their place, simply because that's what defending champions are supposed to do. They win, especially in the knockout stages. That's the burden of greatness. Once you've reached the top of the mountain, nobody applauds you for staying there. They simply expect it. For Argentina, reaching the quarterfinals wasn't considered an achievement. It was considered the minimum. Anything less would become one of the biggest disappointments of the tournament. That's a very different kind of pressure. We often talk about pressure as though it's something only underdogs experience. It isn't. Pressure follows expectation. The greater the expectation, the heavier the pressure. Argentina walked onto the pitch carrying the weight of an entire football nation. Every touch would be analyzed, every mistake replayed, every missed opportunity discussed for days. And standing at the center of all those expectations was Lionel Messi. By this point, Messi didn't need to prove he was one of the greatest players the game had ever seen. That debate had largely been settled, but greatness doesn't free you from expectation. It creates even more of it. Every World Cup becomes another chapter in your legacy. Every knockout match becomes another opportunity for the world to compare you with every legend who came before. That's what Argentina carried into this match: expectation. Egypt carried something very different: hope. Hope is a fascinating thing in sport. It asks almost nothing from the outside world. It doesn't require predictions. It doesn't need betting odds. Hope exists even when logic says it shouldn't. And throughout this tournament, Egypt had quietly given its supporters permission to hope. Not through spectacular football, not through individual brilliance, through discipline, organization, patience. One match at a time, they had earned respect. One result at a time, they had earned belief. This wasn't a team built around a single superstar carrying everyone else. This was a team that trusted structure more than reputation. If one defender stepped forward, another filled the space behind him. If possession was lost, everyone reacted together. If one player made a mistake, 10 teammates were already moving to help. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy, but it was remarkably difficult to play against. That's something television broadcasts don't always capture. The camera follows the ball. Coaches watch everything else. They watch the players who never touch it, the defenders communicating with a glance, the midfielder who closes a passing lane without making a tackle, the forward who forces the ball toward one side of the field instead of another. Those moments rarely appear in highlight reels, yet they're often the moments that decide football matches. Egypt understood that. They weren't trying to outplay Argentina in every aspect of the game. They were trying to make Argentina play a different game altogether. Not a game built on rhythm, a game built on frustration, not a game played at Argentina's pace, a game played at Egypt's pace. If they could slow the match down, if they could stay compact, if they could remove the spaces Argentina loved to attack, then something extraordinary might become possible. That's the first thing I want you to remember about this match. Long before there was controversy, there was a plan. And it was working long before anyone realized just how important that would become. The opening whistle sounded, and almost immediately, something felt different. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. Argentina had the ball. Nobody was surprised by that. In fact, Egypt expected it. If you looked only at the possession statistics, you probably would have assumed the match was unfolding exactly as everyone predicted. But football has a funny way of hiding the truth. Possession and control are not the same thing. One team can have the ball, while the other controls the game. That's exactly what Egypt was trying to accomplish. They didn't care if Argentina completed passes 40 yards from goal. They cared about what happened when those passes moved closer to the penalty area, and every time Argentina tried to play through the middle, Egypt answered. The midfield shifted together, the back line stayed compact. Passing lanes disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. Nothing about it was spectacular. That's what made it so effective. Great defending often goes unnoticed because when it's working, very little actually happens. No desperate sliding tackles, no last-second goal line clearances, no miraculous recoveries, just attackers running out of ideas. As the opening minutes passed, Argentina continued to circulate possession, left, right, back again, looking for a gap that never seemed to stay open for long. Egypt weren't chasing the ball, they were guiding it, inviting Argentina into areas they were comfortable defending while quietly closing the spaces that mattered most. If you freeze the match during those opening exchanges, something remarkable stands out. Almost every Egyptian player is exactly where he's supposed to be. The distances between teammates are small. Nobody is isolated. Nobody is gambling. 11 players moving almost as if they're connected by an invisible rope. That kind of organization doesn't happen because of talent alone. It comes from hours of repetition. Training sessions where coaches stop play to move a defender 2 steps to the left. Video meetings where players study the same attacking patterns again and again. Conversations that most supporters never see. By kickoff, none of those movements felt complicated anymore. They had become instinct. That's one of the hidden stories inside almost every great underdog performance. People remember the passion, the effort, the emotion. What they don't always see is the preparation. Preparation is rarely exciting. It doesn't trend on social media. Nobody makes documentaries about a defensive shape practiced on a training ground 3 days before a match, but when the whistle blows, that's often where history begins. The longer the score remained level, the more Egypt's confidence grew. Not because they believed they had already succeeded, because every minute confirmed something they had suspected all along. Their plan could work. Across the field, Argentina were beginning to experience something completely different. Frustration, not panic, not yet. Championship teams don't panic after 10 or 15 minutes, but frustration has a way of arriving quietly. A pass that's just a little too ambitious, a shot taken from a little farther out than usual, a player trying to solve the problem alone instead of trusting the system. They're tiny moments, easy to miss if you're watching casually. Coaches notice every one of them, so do teammates. Pressure doesn't usually announce itself with one dramatic mistake. It reveals itself through dozens of small decisions that slowly become less patient. That's what Egypt wanted. Not to dominate Argentina, to make Argentina uncomfortable. There's a difference. One is about superiority. The other is about psychology. And psychology has shaped as many World Cups as tactics ever have. You could see it in the body language. Egyptian players celebrated clearances. They applauded interceptions. A successful tackle earned almost as much excitement as a shot on goal. To someone unfamiliar with football, that might seem strange. Why celebrate something so ordinary? Because those moments weren't ordinary. Each one represented another minute survived, another attack stopped, another reminder that the defending champions still hadn't found an answer. Meanwhile, the Egyptian supporters could feel it too. The noise inside the stadium began to change. It wasn't louder. It was more confident. Every successful defensive sequence drew a little more belief from the stands. Every misplaced Argentine pass was greeted with louder applause than the one before. Supporters weren't just reacting anymore, they were participating. Belief has a remarkable way of spreading through a stadium. It starts with the players, then reaches the bench, then the crowd. Eventually, everyone begins feeding off one another. That was happening now, slowly, almost invisibly, but unmistakably. For the first time all evening, it felt possible that this wasn't going to be the comfortable night everyone had predicted. It was becoming something much more interesting. Argentina still had the better players. They still had more experience. They still had Lionel Messi. But football has never been decided by reputation alone. It has always demanded proof. And through the opening stages of this match, Egypt was asking the defending world champions a question they hadn't expected to answer. If you're truly the best team in the world, what happens when your opponent refuses to be intimidated? The answer was about to arrive. The first real opening didn't come from brilliance. It came from persistence. That's another thing great teams understand. You don't always need the perfect attack. Sometimes you simply need one more opportunity than your opponent can defend. Argentina continued to probe. They recycled possession, switched the field, tested Egypt's shape from one side, then the other. They weren't dominating the match the way many people expected, but they were asking difficult questions. Eventually, one of those questions produced the moment they had been waiting for. The referee pointed to the penalty spot. Everything stopped. If you've never watched football before, it's difficult to appreciate just how significant that decision is. A penalty isn't just another scoring chance. It's one of the highest percentage opportunities in the sport. And when the player walking toward the ball is Lionel Messi, most people assume they already know what's about to happen. That's the burden of greatness. The extraordinary becomes expected. Messi placed the ball carefully on the spot. He took a few steps backward. Around him, 21 other players stood completely still. No one could move until the kick was taken. For a brief moment, an entire stadium seemed to hold its breath. Millions watching around the world did the same. If Argentina scored here, the match would feel familiar again. The favorite would be in front. The pressure would disappear. The story would return to the script everyone expected before kickoff. The referee blew the whistle. Messi began his run. He struck the ball, and somehow, Argentina were still level. Overlay, broadcast replay of the penalty. No dramatic effects. Let the footage speak for itself. Whether you remember it as a save, or simply remember that Messi failed to score, the result was exactly the same. Egypt survived. The scoreboard hadn't changed, but something much more important had: confidence. It's amazing how quickly belief can spread through a football team. One successful tackle builds confidence. One dangerous attack builds confidence. Stopping one of the greatest players in football from converting a penalty, that changes everything. You could almost see it happen. The Egyptian players stood a little taller. Passes that had been played cautiously a few minutes earlier were now played with conviction. Instead of immediately clearing every loose ball, they started looking for teammates. Instead of asking, "How do we survive?" they were beginning to ask, "How do we hurt them?" That's a completely different mindset, and it's often the moment when an underdog becomes truly dangerous. Argentina felt it too, not because they suddenly doubted their ability. Champions don't lose confidence that easily, but urgency had begun to replace patience. The passes came a little quicker. The movement became a little more frantic. Players started trying to force openings that simply weren't there. That's one of football's quietest turning points, not when a team starts playing badly, but when it stops trusting the process that made it successful in the first place. Egypt never needed Argentina to fall apart. They only needed Argentina to become slightly less patient than usual. For long stretches of this match, that's exactly what happened. Every minute that passed without a breakthrough strengthened Egypt's belief that they belonged on this stage. Every minute that passed without a breakthrough reminded Argentina that football has no obligation to follow expectations. The defending champions were discovering something uncomfortable. This wasn't going to be won by reputation, it was going to be earned. And then, for the first time all night, Egypt found the space they had been waiting for. Not much, just enough. Enough for one pass, enough for one run, enough to turn disciplined defending into something far more dangerous. A counterattack. Fast, direct, purposeful. The kind of attack that underdogs dream about. The kind of attack favorites spend the entire night trying to prevent. At that moment, almost no one realized they were seconds away from witnessing the most unforgettable sequence of the entire tournament. Not because of what was about to happen, but because of what history would later decide never officially happened. Egypt broke forward with purpose. Not panic, not desperation, purpose. That's the reward for defending well. You spend so much of the match denying space that, eventually, the game gives you some of its own. The pass into midfield was simple. One touch, another pass. Suddenly, Argentina's defensive shape looked different. Not broken, just stretched. For the first time all evening, Egypt weren't reacting. Argentina were. It's remarkable how quickly football can change. For nearly an hour, Egypt had been thinking about distances between defenders, passing lanes, defensive shape. Now, in the space of a few seconds, every thought became forward, attack, run, support, believe. The ball continued moving. One pass became another. The movement was clean, confident. There was no hesitation, no extra touch, no attempt to force something that wasn't there. Everything about the attack suggested a team that had rehearsed this moment countless times, because they had. People often assume counterattacks are spontaneous. They're not. The best counterattacks are organized. Every player knows where to run before the ball is even won. Every option has already been discussed on the training ground. Every decision has been repeated until it becomes instinct. This wasn't chaos. This was preparation meeting opportunity. The final pass arrived. For just a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. The defender lunged, the goalkeeper shifted his weight, and Zico found the ball at his feet. Football has a strange relationship with memory. Supporters can remember the smallest details from moments like these: where they were sitting, who they were watching with, the sound inside the stadium, the feeling in their chest before the shot was even taken. Because sometimes your mind knows something extraordinary is happening before the scoreboard does. Zico didn't have time to think about history. He didn't have time to think about headlines, or documentaries, or debates that would last for years. He had one job: finish. He struck the ball. For a split second, everyone watched. Then the net moved. Goal. Egypt had scored. The stadium exploded. Not all of it, only half. The Egyptian supporters erupted with a kind of joy that only football can create. Players sprinted toward the corner flag. The substitutes poured off the bench. Coaches threw their arms into the air. Some supporters were already crying. Others simply stood frozen, trying to convince themselves that what they had just seen was real, because as far as anyone knew, it was. Think about that moment. Forget everything that happened afterward. Forget every replay you've ever seen. Forget every debate you've ever heard. Live in that moment. Egypt had just taken the lead against the defending world champions in the knockout stage of the World Cup. A nation that had spent decades dreaming about moments like this believed it was finally living one. You can see it on the players' faces. Pure joy. Not cautious celebration, not relief. Joy. Nobody is looking toward the assistant referee. Nobody is waiting for confirmation. Nobody is wondering if something happened earlier in the play. They're celebrating because that's what football players do when they believe they've scored one of the biggest goals of their lives. Zico pulled off his shirt. His teammates caught him before he reached the corner flag. One after another, they piled into the celebration. The bench emptied. Supporters embraced complete strangers. Across Egypt, cafes erupted, living rooms shook, children jumped into the arms of their parents. For 37 seconds, the impossible didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt inevitable. For 37 seconds, Egypt believed they had changed football history. And then, something happened that almost nobody in the stadium expected. Everything stopped. Not gradually, not with confusion at first, just stopped. The celebration continued for another moment. Players were still embracing. Supporters were still singing. The noise inside the stadium hadn't changed. Not yet. Then, almost quietly, the referee raised his hand. At first, very few people understood what it meant. Today, that gesture is instantly recognizable. We've seen it hundreds of times. Players stop. Commentators begin talking about replay angles. Fans instinctively look toward the giant screens. But in this moment, the reaction wasn't immediate. It was hesitation. Egypt's players slowly turned toward the referee, one by one. Some with smiles still on their faces, others pointing toward the center circle, expecting the restart. No one seemed alarmed. Not yet. They were waiting for an explanation. The celebration faded, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: uncertainty. There's something uniquely unsettling about uncertainty in sport. As athletes, you're taught that the outcome should depend on what happens between the whistle at kickoff and the whistle at full time. You train for tackles. You train for passing. You train for finishing. You don't train for waiting, and that's exactly what Egypt found themselves doing. Waiting. Waiting while officials spoke into headsets. Waiting while replay angles were examined. Waiting without being able to influence the outcome in any way. Imagine spending your entire life preparing for one moment, finally living it, and then being told to stand still while someone else decides whether that moment is allowed to exist. That's what made this different. The players couldn't change anything now. There wasn't another run to make, another tackle to win, another shot to take. Their fate had moved somewhere else, away from the pitch, away from their boots, into the hands of the officials. For the supporters, those seconds felt even longer. Inside the stadium, people searched for answers. Some looked at the referee, others looked toward the video boards. Millions watching at home leaned closer to their televisions, waiting for the replay. Everyone was asking the same question: what are they looking at? The replay eventually revealed the focus wasn't the finish itself. No one questioned that the ball had crossed the line. The review centered on an earlier moment in the attacking sequence, something that had happened before Zico ever received the ball. And that's where this story becomes more complicated than many people remember. Under the laws of the game, the video assistant referee is permitted to review elements within the attacking phase of play that directly lead to a goal. That much is straightforward. The debate that followed wasn't about whether VAR existed or whether officials were allowed to review the sequence. The debate was about something much narrower. Did this particular sequence justify overturning the goal? That's a very different question, and it's the reason this match is still discussed years later. Reasonable people watched the same replay and reached different conclusions. The officials reached theirs. Former referees offered theirs. Players had theirs. Supporters certainly had theirs. The referee listened, paused, then made his decision. No goal. Just like that. The celebration ended. Officially, the goal no longer existed. Think about how extraordinary that sentence is. The pass happened. The finish happened. The net rippled. The players celebrated. Millions of people watched it with their own eyes, and yet, in football's official record, it never happened. For Argentina, the decision brought relief. The danger had passed. For Egypt, it felt as though history had been rewritten in real time. Not because the score changed, because the memory changed. For 37 seconds, one nation believed it had produced the greatest moment in its football history. Now it was being asked to continue playing as though those 37 seconds had never existed. That's much easier to write than it is to live. The remarkable thing is, the match still wasn't over. There was still time. Egypt still had an opportunity to write another ending. But anyone watching closely could sense that something had shifted. Not just on the scoreboard, inside the players themselves. The football match had become something else entirely. It had become a test of resilience, and the next 11 minutes would decide everything. The hardest part about heartbreak isn't always the moment it happens. Sometimes it's being asked to carry on as though it didn't. The referee blew the whistle. Play restarted, and for the first few moments, Egypt looked exactly as they had before. The defensive shape remained. The communication continued. Players pointed, tracked runners, closed passing lanes. From a tactical standpoint, very little had changed. But football isn't played by tactics alone. It's played by people. And people carry emotions onto the pitch whether they want to or not. Imagine trying to convince yourself that the biggest moment of your career never happened. Imagine celebrating with your teammates, looking into the stands, seeing your supporters in tears of joy, only to be told that none of it counted. You don't simply erase that from your mind because the whistle blows. You carry it with you. Every run, every pass, every decision. Egypt tried to move forward. To their credit, they didn't lose their discipline. They didn't immediately abandon the game plan. If anything, that's one of the most overlooked parts of this entire match. People often remember what happened over the next 11 minutes and assume Egypt simply collapsed. That's not what happened. They fought. They defended. They continued to believe they could still make history. But now, they were fighting something more than Argentina. They were fighting disappointment, and disappointment is exhausting. On the other side, Argentina experienced something completely different. Relief. Not celebration. Relief. Championship teams understand something that separates them from almost everyone else. They don't spend long wondering what almost happened. They immediately focus on what still can happen. The disallowed goal didn't guarantee Argentina would come back. It gave them another chance to write a different ending. Experienced teams recognize opportunities like that. The body language began to change. Players who had looked frustrated 20 minutes earlier suddenly looked energized. The passing became sharper, the movement more purposeful. Not because Argentina suddenly became a better team, because belief had shifted. That's one of the fascinating things about elite sport. Confidence isn't owned forever. It moves, sometimes slowly, sometimes in an instant. For most of the evening, it had belonged to Egypt. Now it was beginning to drift back toward Argentina. You could feel it without looking at the scoreboard. The attacks came more frequently. The spaces became a little harder for Egypt to close. Defenders who had spent most of the night arriving first to every challenge were suddenly arriving half a step later. Not because they lacked effort, because football has a way of asking one more question than tired legs can answer. Wave after wave of Argentine possession forced Egypt deeper. Every clearance was met by another attack. Every interception was followed by another cross. Every successful defensive sequence bought only a few more seconds before the next challenge arrived. If you've ever stood on a shoreline during high tide, you've seen something similar. One wave doesn't change much, neither does the second or the third. But eventually, the shoreline begins to give way. That's what Argentina were doing now. Not overwhelming Egypt with brilliance, wearing them down with persistence. The clock continued to move. Each minute carried more weight than the last. Egypt knew they didn't have to play perfectly forever, just a little longer. Argentina knew they didn't need 10 chances, they only needed one. And against players of this quality, one chance is often enough. The equalizer finally arrived. For Argentina, it felt like the release of hours of tension compressed into a single moment. Players who had spent most of the evening searching for answers suddenly found one. The roar from the Argentine supporters wasn't just celebration, it was relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. For Egypt, the feeling was entirely different. A lead they believed they had already extended was now gone. Think about that emotional sequence. First, the joy of believing you had gone further ahead. Then the disappointment of seeing that goal erased. Now the realization that the match was level again. Those emotional swings happened in a remarkably short period of time. Against most opponents, perhaps Egypt would have recovered. Against the defending world champions, there was almost no time to breathe. Argentina sensed it, and champions are rarely invited through the same door twice. They kept coming, relentlessly, patiently, confidently. The match had entered its final act, and history was about to choose a different ending than the one Egypt had held in its hands for 37 unforgettable seconds. For so much of this match, Egypt had been asking the questions. Now, they were the ones searching for answers. Football has a cruel sense of timing. Sometimes a team can defend brilliantly for 80 minutes and still be remembered only for the final 10. That isn't fair, but it happens. As Argentina pushed forward again, something subtle changed. Not in Egypt's effort. Their effort never disappeared. It changed in the amount of space they were being forced to defend. Earlier in the match, Egypt had been winning the battle of distance. The back four stayed connected. The midfield stayed close enough to close passing lanes. Every player seemed to arrive exactly where he was needed. Now those distances were growing, only by a step, sometimes less. But at this level, one step is enough. Argentina began finding pockets of space that hadn't existed an hour earlier. A midfielder could finally turn. A winger could receive the ball without immediate pressure. A cross could be delivered before a defender closed it down. None of those moments guaranteed a goal. Together, they changed the rhythm of the match. This is where experience becomes difficult to measure. Championship teams don't always recognize the exact moment their opponent begins to tire. They simply keep asking the same question until the answer changes. Again and again and again. Eventually, it did. Argentina found another breakthrough. This goal felt different from the equalizer. The first had rescued belief. The second restored control. For the first time all night, the defending champions were playing with the confidence everyone expected before kickoff. The passes became quicker. The movement became sharper. Players who had looked tense an hour earlier now looked free again. Football can change emotionally with astonishing speed. Egypt, meanwhile, faced a challenge they had spent the entire evening trying to avoid. They were now chasing the match. That sounds simple. It isn't. Everything about Egypt's game plan had been built around patience, around structure, around choosing the right moments to attack. Now the scoreboard demanded something else. Now they needed urgency, and urgency changes everything. Defenders begin stepping higher, midfielders take greater risks, fullbacks push farther forward. Every adjustment creates another opportunity, not just for you, but for your opponent. That's the hidden cost of chasing a game against a team like Argentina. The very spaces you need to create chances are the same spaces players like Messi know how to exploit. Egypt had no choice. They had to push. They had to believe another opportunity would come, because that's what competitors do. They don't stop believing simply because the situation becomes difficult. They keep playing. They keep fighting. They keep searching for one more chance. There's something deeply admirable about that, even when the ending doesn't reward it. As Egypt committed more players forward, Argentina did what experienced tournament teams have done for generations. They stayed composed. They waited. And when the opportunity presented itself, they were ruthless. The third goal arrived before Egypt had fully recovered from the second. In the span of just 11 minutes, the emotional landscape of the match had been completely transformed. A team that had been dreaming of one of the greatest victories in its football history was suddenly staring at elimination. That's the brutality of knockout football. Not because it is unfair, because it allows no time to recover. There is no next weekend, no second leg, no opportunity to start over. The final whistle keeps moving toward you, whether you're ready or not. And once it arrives, it carries every decision, every mistake, every moment of brilliance with it. The closing minutes felt different now. Argentina weren't simply protecting a lead, they were protecting survival. Egypt weren't simply trying to score, they were trying to reclaim a night that had slipped away almost one decision at a time. When the referee finally looked at his watch for the last time, every player on that pitch knew the score, but I don't think everyone understood the story, not yet, because the real story of this match didn't end with the final whistle. In many ways, it began there. The scoreboard was final. Argentina had survived. Egypt's tournament was over, and just like that, one team walked toward the quarterfinals. The other walked toward the long journey home. If football were only about results, that's where this story would end. Argentina won, Egypt lost, case closed, but that's never been what this series is about. Because the box score can tell you who scored, it can tell you when the goals were scored, it can tell you who advanced. What it cannot tell you is why millions of people were still talking about this match long after the tournament moved on. It cannot tell you what it felt like to be an Egyptian supporter who celebrated a goal with complete certainty, only to watch that certainty disappear. It cannot tell you what it felt like to be an Argentine supporter who experienced relief instead of triumph after a decision that kept a World Cup dream alive. And it certainly cannot explain why two people can watch the exact same replay and walk away believing two completely different things. In the days that followed, the debate grew larger than the match itself. Television studios replayed the incident from every available angle. Former referees discussed the application of the laws of the game. Analysts debated whether the attacking phase had been judged correctly. Supporters defended their positions with complete conviction. The Egyptian Football Association formally protested the officiating. The result stood. Argentina advanced. Officially, the story was over. Unofficially, it was only beginning. Because this match became part of a much larger conversation about football itself. When VAR was introduced, its purpose seemed straightforward: correct clear and obvious mistakes, give referees another chance to get important decisions right. In many ways, it has succeeded. Goals scored from obvious offsides are identified. Cases of mistaken identity are corrected. Incidents that officials couldn't possibly see in real time can be reviewed. The game is, in many respects, more accurate than it was before. But accuracy isn't the only thing supporters care about. They care about trust. They care about consistency. They care about feeling that the biggest moments in the biggest matches are decided by the players on the pitch whenever possible. That's why moments like this resonate. Not because everyone agrees, because they don't. Reasonable people still disagree about this match. Some believe the officials correctly applied the laws of the game. Others believe the interpretation denied Egypt one of the greatest moments in its football history. Both perspectives continue to exist. Both deserve to be understood. And maybe that's the point. The question this match leaves behind was never really about one replay. It was about something much deeper. What does fairness actually look like in modern sport? Is fairness achieved by correcting every possible error, even if it changes the emotional experience of the game? Or is there a point where absolute precision begins to compete with something equally important, the human experience that has always made sport so compelling? Those aren't easy questions. Football hasn't answered them. Neither have its supporters. Maybe it never will. Years from now, people will still remember Lionel Messi's career. They'll remember Argentina's tournament. They'll remember trophies and champions. But somewhere in Egypt, there are supporters who remember something else. They remember exactly where they were standing, exactly who they hugged, exactly how loudly they celebrated. For 37 unforgettable seconds, they believed their country had produced one of the greatest moments in its football history. No official record can erase that memory. No statistics page can measure it. No box score can capture it. Because sometimes the moments that shape sport aren't the ones that last forever in the record books. They're the ones that last forever in people. And maybe that's the real story behind this game. Not that a goal disappeared, but that for 37 seconds, an entire nation believed history had changed. And whether you believe Argentina saved its World Cup or the system saved Argentina depends on more than one decision. It depends on what you believe football is supposed to be. That's a question every supporter has to answer for themselves. And perhaps that's why we're still talking about this match today. I'm Alex, and this has been Beyond the Box Score, because sometimes the most important story has nothing to do with the final score.